Well, good morning, friends. It's me, Pastor Michelle at Harmony Creek Church. Today, I wanted to go ahead and share my sermon that I shared this morning. And also, today was Star Trek Sunday. And so, as you can see, I'm wearing my comm badge. And so that is from Star Trek Next Generation. That is how they communicated with one another. But today we kind of had a whole Star Trek theme. And some people even dressed up in Star Trek clothes. It was amazing. And only at Harmony Creek Church will you have people. Well, we have services where people are free to dress up and have the Vulcan ears, or I think that's what the pointy ears. And I'm wearing my USS Enterprise shirt along with as I said, my comm badge. But I wanted to share. So one of the things. I wanted to share some facts about Star Trek, just in case you wanted to know. So Klingon, which is the language created for the Star Trek universe, is the most widely spoken fictional language in the world. So I love that. And Mapu is good morning in Klingon, at least according to Google. And usually, greetings, though, aren't usually used in everyday conversation in the Klingon language. Because these greetings are seen as unnecessary. So a Klingon would most likely start a conversation with a straightforward statement or a question. So, also, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a Trekkie, and the original communicator inspired the first mobile phone, a phone my dad still uses today. I love that joke. I love that part. And NASA's first space shuttle was named after the Starship Enterprise. So that's just some facts about Star Trek on this day. I think tomorrow's officially Star Trek Day. But here at Harmony Creek Church, we had Star Wars Day back in May. And I was like, well, we have to have Star Trek Day as well. So, So I wanted to just share all that before. And also, for those of you who may have not noticed, and I forgot to point it out, on the bulletin cover was a really funny cartoon. And so it shows two sheep, which kind of leads into next Sunday when I talk about the parable of the lost sheep. But one of them says, Jesus has good intentions. But really, what sort of party would you have if you just invited those down and out? You'd have the Eucharist, the offering of forgiveness and anticipation of heaven. So Jesus does know how to party. So today we did have communion, which is also known as the Eucharist. Not everyone, I forgot to point out, I wanted to point that out to people when they looked at the bulletin. But anyway, today, my sermon is around a passage from Luke 14, and it's the passage where Jesus tells the parable about a wedding banquet and how he invites people, don't sit at the place of honor, go and sit at the lowest place because the host may invite you to sit at the highest place. And then he says, for all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. And then he talks about how if you give a luncheon, if you give a special meal, don't invite your friends, don't invite those who can repay you back easily. Invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and you will be blessed. Invite those who can't repay you. Invite the outsiders. But I do want to share the special quote that was read for those of you who may have not been part of the service today. But just hear this quote by Sharon R. Blizzard, who's a teacher and a preacher. She says, serving God and neighbor is more like a community potluck than a gourmet meal in the finest restaurant. It's less about perfection and more about improvisation. It's less about form and more about function. It's less about looks and much, much more about love. It has something to do with rubbing elbows with strangers and kin alike. After all, both can present challenges. Instead of a guest list carefully crafted to reflect our wishes and wiles, Jesus crafts a grace list that is an open invitation to the party. The point is this: at Jesus' banquet table, there's room for everyone. Grant Aunt Mabel's lime jello salad can exist peacefully with vegan Valerie's fresh green bean vinaigrette. Homemade mac and cheese can sit side by side with a bag of store-bought potato chips. Hamburgers and tamales and snow cones coexist and complement one another in delightful ways. When everyone brings their best offering, when we all show up, the banquet table groans with the goodness of God. End quote. I love that quote because it explains, and it really goes into Harmony Creek Church, where everyone who enters into our space, into our community, they are free to be exactly who they are. Everyone brings their whole self to the table, and that is good. You know, when God sees that, God sees it and says, that is very good. So that was a lot before my actual sermon. So let's get into my sermon. So I chose a text, obviously, that has to do around eating. And eating is something that Jesus loved to do. Eating is also something that Jesus' followers love to do and churches love to do. There's time and time again, churches have meals. Either it be once a month or perhaps even every Sunday. A friend of mine pastors a church where they have a potluck every single Sunday. So in the first few verses of Luke 14, which was not included in my reading today, I chose to do Luke 14, chapter 14, 7 through 14, instead of 1 through 14. But in the early parts of this chapter, before verse 7, it explains that Jesus was sitting down with the top leaders of the Pharisees for dinner. And while at dinner, it says in the passage, everyone had their eyes on Jesus. They were watching his every move. They wanted to see what he was saying. And actually, this passage kind of comes around the same time that Jesus had a whole conversation about healing on the Sabbath and whether or not you would heal on the Sabbath. Now, the thing is, everyone's watching Jesus, but also Jesus was watching them. And so Jesus... And I love, before we dive deeper into this story, though, about this dinner party, let's hear this story about another dinner party that was happening in another part of town. So a woman and her daughter are hosting a dinner party. When all the guests arrive, the woman asks the little girl to say grace. And the little girl's like, Mommy, I don't know what to say. And the mom says, well, you've heard me pray. Just say what you've heard me say. That could go many ways. So the girl says, okay. And so the time comes, and when I said this joke, I forgot to say that, but I think people got it. So the girl says in front of everyone at the dinner party, she's like, okay, I'll say what you have said. And the girl says, Jesus, what was I thinking, inviting all these people over to my house? That's a fun joke. And it really goes along with the text. Because we know that Jesus often had friends in low places. He wasn't afraid to invite just about everyone at the table. And perhaps those sitting at the table and supping with Jesus, and maybe even Jesus himself, wondered at times, why in the world did we invite all these people to dinner? Now, you see, in our reading from Luke, we find Jesus not only eating, but he's also doing some people watching. He's watching as people around him scramble for places of honor around the table. He sees all this going on, and then he decides to give this parable, to give this lesson about humility and hospitality, to give this lesson about table manners. And he isn't just teaching good table manners. He's educating those around him about the kingdom of God. This kingdom, which Jesus talked about often through his parables, which were the simple stories, not so simple, but the stories that Jesus gave to illustrate and talk about the kingdom of God. But in this kingdom, he proposed new priorities and called for a new way of living and being in this world. And so in this parable, he's talking about a wedding banquet. Now, one of the things that is important to point out is that Jesus lived in a shame and honor and shame culture where status was pretty much everything. And one of the key places where status was displayed was at special dinners, much like a wedding banquet. Guests of honor were seated closest to the host, while those of lesser importance sat further and further away. So when I think about this, it's easy to see why Jesus might have chosen a wedding in his parable. When you go to a wedding reception where there are assigned seats, usually the lower the number, the closer you are to the guests of honor, the wedding party. I will say that I don't think I've ever been at a low table for a wedding. Most of the time I'm at like table 30 or 40 because I think that's where they place the pastors or the officiants, I guess. I did do a wedding yesterday, but I wasn't even invited to the reception they had. Because actually I don't know if they had a reception, but it was a really beautiful wedding for these two men that I married yesterday. But anyway, that's off topic. Going back to wedding receptions. So the lower the table, the closer you were to the wedding party. The higher the table number, probably the further away. So in 2017, there was this movie that was released that I remember watching, and it was called Table 19. And in the movie, Eloise has been relieved of her duties as maid of honor after she's dumped by the best man via text. But Eloise decides to hold up her head high and attend the wedding anyway. But she finds herself seated at table 19, which is in the back of the ballroom, nowhere near the wedding party, with a disparate group of strangers, most of whom should have known to just send regrets, but not before sending something nice off the wedding registry. So Eloise, at first, in the beginning of the movie, she sees this and she's like, I don't belong at this table of misfits and rejects. But the beautiful thing about the movie is that throughout there, you see this transformation. Eloise soon discovers that these people at table 19, these people whom she judged as perhaps rejects and worthy of being at table 19, these people became her friends, became people that she built a life with after the wedding. Like, they stayed in contact. They kind of showed that at the end of the movie, like a little glimpse into the future. You know, she went from not knowing any of these people and then having them become some of her best friends. And I love that transformation that you see because I think that's what happens in churches. What should happen, at least. You know, we begin as strangers. We begin as strangers in this journey. But then we soon find belonging with one another. And that's one of the many things I think that keep people coming back week after week. In fact, one of the things that really draws people to Harmony Creek Church is that when they come through the doors here, they have found a place to belong. They have found a place to call home. And it is an absolutely beautiful thing. And that's something I love when I do new member classes. It's whenever I ask people, what is bringing you to Harmony Creek? It's that home. It's that belongingness. It's that people feel that. They feel like they're coming home when they walk through the doors of our church. And I absolutely love that. I know that's how I felt when I first began. That's how I felt even when I was interviewing for the position here. That's how I felt even in moments when I was still at David's UCC and I would come to events at Harmony Creek Church, or I would come to hear my friend Ruth preach. I felt like I was coming home. Yeah, it's no small thing. But anyway, going back to the movie, as I watched, as I watched Table 19, as I watched it, I couldn't help but think that, Jesus probably would have felt right at home at Table 19. Perhaps that's where Jesus would have been placed. Or more than likely, it's the people at Table 19 that Jesus wanted his listeners to invite to their dinner. Perhaps it's the people at Table 19, the ones who couldn't repay if they were invited to something, or they were seen as the marginalized. Those were the people that had never been invited before. Those were the people that Jesus were lifting up. He wanted his listeners to invite those who couldn't repay them back. So in Jesus, and that was a big thing for Jesus to share that in a parable, because in Jesus's day, when you invited someone to a dinner, it would put them kind of in your debt and would make a claim on them to return the favor. It was an I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine type of world, and meals were a great way to scratch someone's back. So Jesus, in this moment, he's inviting his first century followers, but he's also inviting us to live differently, to break the rules of a what have you done for me lately type culture and value others, not because of what they can do for you, but because of who they are, simply. We are all beloved children of God. Absolutely everyone, no exceptions, should have a place at the table. And Jesus was someone that was in the business of building bigger tables. You know, when we read through the Gospels, we see that Jesus was constantly adding people to God's table and showing the world around him that God's table is one where there's always room for one more. And he especially paid attention to those on the margins, those who were oppressed. He especially paid attention to those who had never been invited before, to those who were seen as invisible. He saw the invisible. He loved the unlovable. Those are things that Jesus did, and those are things that we, as followers of Jesus Christ, are called to do as well, as best as we can. And so, you know, each time we as the church, we as followers of Jesus, each time that we pull up a chair for someone to be included, especially those who have never been included before, especially those who have never been invited to the table even. Each time we do this, we're giving people a sense of belonging. We're giving people a place to call home. We're giving people the chance to feel loved and wanted for who they are. We're giving them, as I said, a place to call home. And home is more than just a physical place. It's a feeling of knowing that you are right where you belong. And that's no small thing. And so I think about Star Trek. And how, from the very beginning, Star Trek was a show that was including everyone at the table. You know, back in the 60s when the original series was on, you know, during the time of segregation, you know, they had the first interracial kiss. They had, during the Cold War, they had a Russian leader named Chekhov. They had women be in leadership and black women and even now in the more current series, they're continuing to expand the table and include more characters who are trans and trans and on the LGBT plus LGBTQIA2 plus. I don't know if I'm getting all the letters there, but the rainbow alphabet. They're expanding the table even more as in their more current series that they continue to do with Star Trek. But Star Trek, one of the message, and I will say, and I said it during my sermon today, I will be honest and full confession, I'm not a Trekkie, but I have seen an episode or two. And I've read a lot of articles about why Star Trek is very inclusive and how they promote that. And I know that doesn't make me a Trekkie. I'm slowly wanting to come around because I looked online and found a list that says what the chronological order to watch all the shows in. So right now, I'm like, I'm going to start with Star Trek Enterprise and work my way down the list because I'm someone that really likes a list where I can cross things off. So that's kind of on my agenda, personal agenda, on top of everything else I watch. But the articles I have read about Star Trek and talking to people that I love, who are also who are Trekkies, it makes me want to dive into that universe because Star Trek was this amazing show for its time, a show that was ahead of its time. And one of the things that Star Trek does is it explores this question of what does it mean to be human? But also, what does it mean, what does it mean to be human, especially when you encounter non-human life forms? And maybe we're not going to be encountering aliens, or strange visitors from another planet. But we do encounter people who are different from us, people who may not look like us, people who may vote differently than us. And what are we called to do? Because what Star Trek teaches us, when we encounter people who are different from us, we're just called to love them. We're just called to welcome them. We're just called to embrace them for who they are. Not for who we wish they could be, but for who they are. And that is hard work. And I say that only because I have people in my own family, the family of my origin, that it is hard for me sometimes to love them for exactly who they are. Because who they are sometimes really ticks me off. But that's the kind of love that Jesus calls for us to send out into the world. A love that is transforming. And for me, and I shared this today, for me it is so important. And what I love about Harmony Creek Church is that we are a church for people who may have been hurt by church. We are a church for those people who may be a recovering Baptist, Catholic, Methodist, whatever they may be. They come into our church and they feel at home. They feel like they can be their full selves. And that is no small thing. Harmony Creek Church we are a church that is really good at boldly inviting those who have never been invited before. We are a church that is good, that is really good at boldly loving those who may have not been loved before. Boldly embracing those who may have not felt embraced before. That is what the mission of the church is about. And for me, someone who has survived church abuse myself, someone who spent so many years of the first part of my life thinking that God didn't love me, and knowing what that felt like, knowing that I felt like I was damaged, or knowing that I felt like I wasn't worthy of love, the discovery, the realization that God has loved me all along, it's a life-changing, transforming, life-saving truth. And for me, that is the most important thing that I want people to get out of anything I say from the pulpit. The most important thing that I can say week to week is to remind people that they are loved for exactly who they are. Because sometimes there may be someone in the church, maybe someone visiting with us that has never actually heard that. And it's not just me that should be proclaiming that. It should be every one of us who claim to be followers of Jesus. Because what does Jesus do? He calls us to tell others. He calls us to be invitational, to be like, come and see. And that's what I want people that come to Harmony Creek Church and are transformed by it to tell others, come and see what this church is like. Come and see. Come and see the love that exists in this space. Because for me, that is the most important message that I will never stop preaching. That every single person, no matter what, every single person as they fully are, they are loved by God beyond measure. And for me, that is going to be the message that I will preach until the day I die. So my friends, never forget how loved you are. And never forget that at God's table, there is always room for one more. Much love to all of you, my friends.